Frank Zappa did not believe in gods. He believed in structure, in counterpoint, in the mathematics underneath melody that most musicians never bothered to learn. He believed that rock and roll at its core was a simple thing: three chords, a backbeat, a crowd willing to be fooled. He did not say this with contempt exactly. He said it the way a surgeon might describe a scraped knee. Technically accurate, slightly bored. It was late 1967, and Frank Zappa was already something the music world didn't quite have a category for. The Mothers of Invention had released two albums that critics called everything from genius to unlistenable, sometimes in the same sentence. He had studied Edgar Varese as a teenager, hunting down the composer's obscure recordings from library shelves in Southern California, like a man searching for something he didn't yet have a name for. He had analyzed Stravinsky's Rite of Spring note by note at the age of 14, not because anyone asked him to, but because the structure of it bothered him in a way he needed to resolve. He could hear a piece of music once and tell you not only what was wrong with it, but why it was wrong. Structurally, harmonically, rhythmically. This was not a gift he wore quietly. He had also developed, by this point, a specific and well-defended skepticism toward virtuosity as performance. He had seen too many guitar players who were technically impressive and musically empty. Men who could play anything and say nothing. Speed was not language. Flash was not content. He had written this down somewhere, probably more than once. He believed it the way people believe things they arrived at through actual thought rather than received opinion. He knew who Jimi Hendrix was. Everyone in London knew who Jimi Hendrix was. Zappa had listened to Are You Experienced when it came out that summer. He'd put the needle on the record, sat back in the particular way he sat when he was listening critically, very still, one hand near his chin, and let it play. He noted the chord voicings. He noted the studio techniques, the panning, the fuzz tone layered over fuzz tone until it became something almost orchestral. He noted all of it, cataloged it, filed it away. Then he said nothing. That was telling, though nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. The studio was on Basing Street in Notting Hill. It was a Thursday evening in November, the kind of cold that came off the Thames and settled into brick and stayed there. Zappa had booked the main room for his own session, a complex piece he'd been assembling for weeks, something with brass and woodwinds and a guitar part that required 4 separate overdubs to land correctly. The session had gone long. The brass players had left. The engineer was somewhere in the building getting coffee. Zappa was in the control room alone, listening back to the last 2 hours of tape, making notations in the margin of a manuscript sheet. He worked fast when he listened. Shorthand only he could read. Little symbols that meant too much decay here, or the interval is wrong, or simply no. He was on the 3rd playback when he heard it. Not from the speakers, from somewhere else in the building. It was faint at first, the kind of sound that registers before the brain decides to register it. Low, unhurried. A guitar, no amplification worth mentioning, coming from one of the smaller isolation booths down the corridor. Zappa put down his pencil. He did not stand up immediately. He sat with it for a moment, the way you might sit with a smell that is almost familiar, but not quite. His tape was still rolling, but he was no longer listening to it. He was listening to the corridor. The playing was slow, deliberate, nothing like what he had heard on the record. He stood up. The corridor was narrow and lit badly, the fluorescent strip at the far end flickering the way they always did in buildings like this. An irregular pulse, almost rhythmic, almost not. Zappa walked toward the sound without hurrying. He was not a man who hurried toward things. He had always found that moving too quickly towards something changed what it was before you arrived. He passed the machine room with its stacked reels and smell of magnetic oxide, passed the second control room with its dark glass, and stopped outside the door of the small isolation booth at the end. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap, he could see a sliver of the room, a stool, a cable looped on the floor, the edge of a Stratocaster, and a hand, one hand, moving up the neck with a slowness that felt almost wrong, like watching film at the wrong speed. He did not push the door open. He stood in the corridor and listened. What he heard did not match the category he had filed it under. Zappa had a precise internal taxonomy for guitarists. He knew where they all went. The blues players, Feeling without theory, powerful in their limitation, speaking a dialect he respected even when he found it repetitive. The jazz players, theory without surrender, precise and occasionally cold, but at least literate. The classical players, theory elevated to architecture, which was closer to what he cared about, though most of them had never touched anything that resembled rock and didn't want to. The rock players, neither, mostly, just appetite and volume, playing loud enough that the lack of interior logic didn't show. He had a place for all of them, and the places were not unkind, just accurate. What was happening inside that room did not go anywhere he had prepared. It was not a performance. That was the first thing. There was nobody to perform for. The man inside the booth was not playing to be heard. He was playing the way Zappa sometimes wrote in the middle of the night. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just inside the thing, following wherever it went. But the structure was there, not obvious, not announced, running underneath the improvisation like a current under still water. Zappa recognized a harmonic idea that came and went in about 4 seconds. It appeared, resolved, disappeared. He had seen that idea in a Bartok string quartet, not the same notes, the same logic. The understanding that tension did not need to be loud to be tension. He stood very still. Inside the booth, Jimi Hendrix did not know anyone was listening. He had arrived early for his own session, which was not scheduled for another hour. He had asked if he could use the small room to warm up, and the engineer had said yes and left him there. He was not warming up in any conventional sense. He was thinking out loud in the way that some people think only through their hands. He played a phrase and stopped. He played it again, differently. He played it a third time and held the last note until it decayed to almost nothing. And then he sat with the silence for a moment before the next phrase arrived. This was the part that stopped Zappa entirely. The silence, not the notes, the silence between them, the deliberate space, the understanding that what you didn't play was as structural as what you did, that the pause was not an absence but a choice, that music was not sound but the relationship between sound and its own disappearance. This was not instinct. You could not arrive at that through instinct alone. You had to have thought about it, deeply, privately, in ways that never showed up in interviews or record sleeves. Zappa had never heard Jimi Hendrix think before. The record hadn't sounded like this. The record had been something else. Massive, electric, confrontational, designed. This was the thing before the design. This was the room where the work happened before anyone was invited to see the work. He stood there for a long time, longer than he would have admitted, probably. At some point, the playing shifted into something more recognizable. A blues figure, slow and then faster, the guitarist finding his way toward the session that was coming. The thinking out loud part had ended. Zappa stepped back from the door. He walked back down the corridor. He sat down in the control room. His tape was still running. He looked at his manuscript sheet. The notations he'd made before were still there. He read them over. He did not add to them that evening. They did not meet that night. Zappa left before Hendrix's session began. There was no conversation, no exchange, no moment of mutual recognition in a doorway. Just a man who had stood in a corridor and listened to something he had not expected, and then walked away and said nothing about it. Not to his bandmates, not to his engineer, not to the journalists who followed him and wrote down everything he said. The silence after was its own kind of notation. In the years that followed, Frank Zappa gave many interviews. He had opinions about everything and delivered them in complete sentences, often cutting, always precise. He talked about music theory with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting all his life for someone to ask. He talked about the music industry with the kind of organized contempt that suggested he had been taking notes for years. He talked about the specific failures of specific people with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about where he stood or why. He almost never talked about Jimi Hendrix. A writer for Crawdaddy magazine noted it once, in 1969. He'd asked Zappa directly, what did he make of Hendrix? Zappa had given what the writer described as a long pause, which was unusual for him. Then he had said, Hendrix understands something about space that most people with formal training spend years trying to understand and never get there. And then he had changed the subject. The writer didn't press. He probably should have. By 1991, Frank Zappa was ill, though very few people knew how ill. He was still working, composing, recording, testifying before Congress about music censorship. His productivity had not slowed. Only the people close to him could see that something had shifted, that the energy was different, that he was working with a particular urgency. He gave an interview to a German music journalist that autumn. The journalist had been careful, thorough, the kind of interviewer Zappa respected. They had talked for 2 hours about composition, about his influences, about the state of American music. Near the end, the journalist asked, "Was there a guitarist who genuinely surprised you? Someone whose playing changed the way you thought about the instrument?" Zappa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard someone playing once in a studio corridor. I didn't go in. I just stood outside and listened. And I remember very clearly the moment I started trying to analyze what he was doing, because that's what I do. That's how I listen. And the analysis just stopped. Not because it was too complex, because it was doing the same thing the analysis would have been trying to do, but from the other direction. He arrived at the same place I would have tried to construct. He just walked there." The journalist waited. "It's a strange thing," Zappa continued, his voice level, almost matter-of-fact. "You spend so long building a language to describe music, and then sometimes you hear something and the language isn't useful anymore. Not because the music is beyond language, because the music already is the language." "Who was it?" the journalist asked. Zappa looked at him for a moment. "You know who it was," he said, and then he moved on. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970 at 27. He left behind 3 studio albums and a body of live recordings that musicians would study for decades. He also left behind a number of moments that were never recorded. The small rooms, the early arrivals, the private thinking out loud that only a handful of people ever witnessed. Frank Zappa died in December 1993. He left behind more than 60 albums and a reputation for saying exactly what he thought about exactly everything. He never said Jimi Hendrix's name in print, in any interview that survives, in the context of that German conversation or any other. He didn't need to. Some silences are not absences. Some silences are the whole point.